Bill Henderson's weathered hand froze mid-air, his auction paddle trembling as three German shepherds cowered in rusted cages before him. The emaciated dogs bore fresh wounds, their once proud coats matted with filth and despair. These weren't livestock, they were dying souls. The auctioneer's voice cracked. "Do I hear 500 for the lot?" Silence stretched like a held breath across the Montana fairgrounds. Then came the bidding war. Bill never expected, voices climbing toward numbers that could destroy him. Martha Chen, the bank manager, gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles went white. She'd served Bill his foreclosure notice just yesterday, 30 days to save the ranch that had been his life for 40 years. $15,000. The words erupted from Bill's throat before his mind could stop them, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd like thunder. Who was this mysterious competing bidder? And why did saving 3 broken dogs suddenly feel like the most important decision of his 72 years? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Bill Henderson had been a different man. The kind who woke before dawn not from insomnia but from purpose. His German shepherd Max would stretch beside the bed, amber eyes already alert, ready for another day of checking cattle and mending fences on the sprawling Montana ranch that had been home for 4 decades. Then came the morning Max didn't wake up. The cancer had taken him quietly in his sleep, the way Sarah had always said she hoped to go. Bill found himself talking to an empty house, setting 2 food bowls out of habit before remembering. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the tick of Sarah's grandmother clock and the distant lowing of cattle that somehow seemed mournful now. At 72, Bill carried himself with the careful dignity of a man whose body bore the map of hard living. Silver hair swept back from a weathered face, hands still strong but marked with age spots that reminded him daily of time's passage. The bronze star from Vietnam sat in a drawer, rarely mentioned but never forgotten, along with commendations from his years as a canine handler. Those dogs had saved more lives than he cared to count. The ranch stretched across 800 acres of prime Montana grassland, backed by pine-covered hills that caught the morning light like a promise. It should have been his legacy, passed down to children who never came, then to his granddaughter Jennifer, who was too busy saving lives in medical school to think about saving land. Financial reality had crept in like winter fog, property taxes climbing, cattle prices falling, and medical bills from Sarah's final years that insurance wouldn't cover. The bank notice had arrived on official letterhead. 30 days to catch up on payments or face foreclosure. Martha Chen had delivered it personally, her eyes soft with apology. "I'm sorry, Bill. The board's decision." Jennifer called weakly from Johns Hopkins, her voice bright with determination and dimmed by exhaustion. Pre-med had stretched into medical school into residency applications, each step costing more than the last. She never asked for money directly, but Bill heard the strain when she mentioned working double shifts at the campus coffee shop. The auction had been Martha's suggestion. "Just browse, Bill. See what's out there. Sometimes a change of scenery helps perspective." He'd driven the 40 miles to Billings expecting nothing more than a distraction from the empty house and the countdown to losing everything he'd built. Instead, he'd found 3 pairs of desperate eyes that reminded him why some battles were worth fighting, even when you couldn't afford to win. The Billings livestock auction buzzed with the familiar energy of rural commerce, but Bill Henderson felt like an outsider looking in. Ranchers and worn wranglers examined cattle with practiced eyes, their conversations a mix of weather reports and market prices. He'd driven here on Martha Chen's advice, seeking nothing more than distraction from the foreclosure notice burning a hole in his jacket pocket. The main arena showcased prime breeding stock and farm equipment, but it was the side lot that caught his attention. A hand-painted sign read, "Special Items, Exotic Animals," in faded red letters. Bill wandered over, expecting maybe some exotic chickens or a retired circus pony. What he found stopped him cold. 3 German shepherds huddled in separate transport cages, their conditions so shocking that several onlookers had already turned away in disgust. The largest, a male with coat coloring that reminded Bill painfully of Max, pressed himself against the far corner of his cage. Fresh wounds crisscrossed his shoulders, and his ribs showed clearly through matted fur. His eyes held the hollow look of an animal that had given up hope. The female was smaller, but no less heartbreaking. Her left ear hung at an odd angle, partially torn, and infected wounds dotted her legs where chains had rubbed the skin raw. Despite her own suffering, she positioned herself protectively in front of the 3rd cage, which held what appeared to be a younger male, barely more than a puppy despite his size. "Jesus Christ," muttered Tom Bradley, a rancher Bill knew from church. "Who the hell would do this to dogs?" A well-dressed man in an expensive suit appeared beside the cages, his smile too wide and his eyes too cold. "Gentlemen, these are premium German shepherds from championship bloodlines. They've been through intensive training and are ready for specialized work." Bill felt his jaw clench. Training for what? Security work, primarily. Guard dogs for high-end clients who require animals with proven resilience. The man's tone made Bill's skin crawl. They've been conditioned to handle stress, respond to commands, and maintain focus under pressure. The euphemisms were thin veils over obvious abuse. Bill had worked with military K-9s in Vietnam, had seen how proper training built confidence and trust between handler and dog. This wasn't training. This was systematic brutalization designed to break spirits and create weapons instead of partners. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Collins, approached with obvious reluctance. "Folks, we're moving to Lot 47. These German shepherds come as a group. Minimum bid $500. "What's their history?" called out Janet Morrison, the local veterinarian. Her voice carried professional concern mixed with barely controlled anger. The suited man stepped forward. "Marcus Steele, Apex Security Solutions. These animals were bred and trained specifically for protection work. Clean veterinary records, up-to-date shots, ready for immediate deployment." Bill studied Steele more closely. Something about the man set off every instinct honed by years of military service and decades of reading livestock buyers. The expensive clothes couldn't hide the predator underneath, and the way he avoided direct eye contact with the dogs suggested a relationship built on fear rather than respect. $500, came a voice from the back of the small crowd. Bill turned to see a rough-looking man with scars on his hands and the dead eyes of someone comfortable with violence. $600, called another bidder, this one wearing the kind of flashy jewelry that screamed new money and bad decisions. Bill felt his chest tighten as he realized what was happening. These weren't buyers looking for family pets or even legitimate guard dogs. These were the kinds of men who would use dogs for illegal fighting, or worse, as disposable tools in criminal enterprises. The largest male lifted his head slightly, and for just a moment, his eyes met Bill's across the crowded lot. In that gaze, Bill saw something that hit him like a physical blow. It was the same intelligent steadiness he remembered from Max during their first meeting at the shelter 15 years ago. The same calm assessment that marked dogs with the capacity for deep loyalty if given the chance. $800, called the scarred man. $1,000, countered his competitor. Janet Morrison stepped closer to the cages, her veterinary training overriding auction protocol. "These animals need immediate medical attention." Whoever buys them needs to understand they're looking at thousands in veterinary bills." Steele's smile never wavered. "They're hardy animals, Doctor. Survivors. That's what makes them valuable." The bidding climbed steadily as more unsavory characters joined the fray. Bill found himself calculating the contents of his checking account, the equity in his ranch, the money he'd been saving for Jennifer's medical school expenses. Every number came up short of what these dogs deserved, which was freedom from the kind of people willing to pay premium prices for broken animals. At $12,000, the bidding slowed. The scarred man looked determined to win, his competitor finally shaking his head and stepping back. Bill felt time running out like sand through an hourglass, each second bringing these three souls closer to a fate that would make their current suffering look merciful. The auctioneer raised his gavel. Going once at $12,000. That's when Bill Henderson made the decision that would change everything. $15,000! The words exploded from Bill's throat with such force that conversation stopped mid-sentence across the auction lot. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the auctioneer's gavel froze halfway to its downward arc. The silence that followed was so complete that Bill could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Martha Chen's face went pale as moonlight. She knew exactly what $15,000 meant to Bill Henderson. It was more than half his remaining savings, money he couldn't afford to lose with a foreclosure notice in his pocket and a granddaughter's medical school bills mounting like storm clouds. "Did he just say 15,000? Whispered Tom Bradley, his voice carrying in the stunned quiet. The scarred man who'd been bidding turned to study Bill with calculating eyes. Something in the old rancher's weathered face and military bearing made him step back from the cages, recognizing a different kind of dangerous than what he was used to dealing with. Marcus Steele's practiced smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been surprise or perhaps recognition. His cold gaze swept over Bill, cataloging details with the precision of a predator sizing up unexpected competition. "Going once at 15,000, Collins called, his voice cracking slightly. The auctioneer had been working livestock sales for 20 years, but he'd never seen a bid that high for anything other than prize-breeding bulls. Janet Morrison pushed through the small crowd, her veterinary bag already in hand. "Bill, what in God's name are you doing? Those dogs need thousands more in medical care. You can't afford this." But Bill wasn't listening to financial reason anymore. He was looking into the eyes of the largest German shepherd, seeing something that transcended money or logic. The dog had managed to lift his head, and despite his obvious pain and weakness, he was watching Bill with an intensity that reminded him achingly of Max's final days. "These aren't just dogs," Bill said quietly, his words carrying across the lot with the authority of a man who'd spent decades making life-or-death decisions. "Their family looking for home." The crowd murmured uneasily. Several people exchanged glances that clearly said the old rancher had finally lost his mind. $15,000 for 3 half-dead animals, when everyone knew he was facing foreclosure, seemed like the decision of a man who'd given up on rational thinking. "Going twice at 15,000, Collins announced, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. That's when Steele made his move. He stepped forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the gravel, and raised his hand with the casual confidence of a man for whom money was merely a tool. 20,000. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. Martha Chen actually stumbled, reaching out to steady herself against Tom Bradley's arm. Janet Morrison's medical bag slipped from nerveless fingers, hitting the ground with a muffled thud. But Bill didn't flinch. If anything, the competing bid seemed to steel his resolve. He'd seen enough predators in his time, human and animal, to recognize what Steele represented. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about preventing 3 innocent souls from falling into the hands of someone who saw them as commodities to be exploited. 25,000, Bill said, his voice steady despite the fact that he was now bidding money he didn't have, money that would require mortgaging the ranch he'd spent 40 years building. The murmur from the crowd turned ugly. "Crazy old fool," someone muttered, "throwing away his granddaughter's future for a bunch of mutts." "Those dogs could kill someone," added another voice. "German shepherds that size, trained for violence. He's endangering the whole community." But there were other voices too. Sarah Martinez, who'd lost her husband in Afghanistan and understood the bond between soldiers and their canine partners, stepped closer to the cages. "Look at them," she said softly. "Really look. They're not dangerous. They're broken." The female German shepherd had managed to position herself between the crowd and the youngest dog, despite her own obvious injuries. Her maternal instincts overrode pain and fear, a display of courage that reminded everyone present what love looked like when stripped to its essence. Steele's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 30,000. The bid sent a collective gasp through the crowd. Tom Bradley grabbed Bill's arm. "This is insane. Walk away, Bill." "Those dogs aren't worth bankrupting yourself over." But Bill shook off his neighbor's grip, his attention focused entirely on the cages and the 3 pairs of eyes watching this human drama unfold. The largest male had struggled to his feet, swaying with weakness, but maintaining eye contact with Bill. There was something in that gaze, a question, maybe, or a plea. Bill thought about Max, about the morning 15 years ago when he'd walked into the county shelter looking for a farm dog and walked out with a best friend. Max had been scheduled for euthanasia that afternoon, another victim of overcrowding and limited resources. One decision had given them both 12 years of companionship that had carried Bill through Sarah's death and the loneliness that followed. 35,000. Bill said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. The crowd erupted in a mixture of admiration and outrage. Someone shouted about calling adult protective services, suggesting Bill was mentally incompetent. Others muttered about teaching old dogs new tricks, the irony lost on them entirely. Collins looked between Bill and Steele like a referee in a boxing match that had gotten out of hand. "Do I hear 40,000? Steele studied Bill with new interest, his cold eyes taking in the worn jeans, the flannel shirt with carefully mended tears, the work boots that had seen decades of honest labor. This wasn't a wealthy eccentric making an impulse purchase. This was a man betting everything on something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. 40,000, Steele said softly, but his voice carried clearly in the tense silence. Bill felt the weight of financial reality crushing down on him like a collapsed barn. $40,000 would mean losing the ranch for certain, would mean Jennifer's education fund disappearing, would mean destroying everything he'd worked for over 7 decades of life. But then the youngest German shepherd whimpered softly, and the sound went through Bill like a knife. It was the same sound Max had made during those final nights, when pain medication couldn't touch the deep ache of a body wearing out. $50,000, Bill said, and knew he'd just signed away his entire world. The gavel fell with a sound like a gunshot, sealing Bill's fate and transforming 3 broken German shepherds into the most expensive decision of his life. Marcus Steele's face remained impassive as he stepped back into the crowd, but not before giving Bill a look that promised this transaction was far from over. The immediate aftermath felt surreal. Bill signed papers with hands that trembled not from age, but from the magnitude of what he'd just done. Martha Chen appeared at his elbow, her face a mask of professional concern barely containing personal panic. "Bill, we need to talk," she said quietly, guiding him away from the dispersing crowd. "You just spent money you don't have. The bank will want to know how you plan to cover this." But Bill was focused on the 3 cages being loaded onto his trailer, each one containing a life he'd just purchased with his future. The largest male, he'd decided to call him Rex, watched the proceedings with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the significance of what had transpired. The drive back to the ranch passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the soft whimpering from the trailer. Bill found himself talking to the dogs through the rear window, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used with Max during their first uncertain days together. "Easy now, friends. We're going somewhere safe, somewhere you can heal." Dr. Janet Morrison was waiting in his barn, having raced ahead to prepare an impromptu veterinary station. Her examination of the 3 dogs revealed the full extent of their suffering in clinical detail that made Bill's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. Rex, the largest male, bore evidence of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit. Fresh whip marks crisscrossed his shoulders, and his response to human touch spoke of conditioning through pain and fear. Despite this, when Bill slowly extended his hand, Rex managed a tentative sniff before pressing his nose briefly against the weathered palm. "That's remarkable," Janet murmured, watching the interaction. "After what he's been through, he should be terrified of human contact." The female, whom Bill had mentally named Luna for the crescent-shaped marking on her dark coat, proved more challenging. She'd positioned herself defensively, refusing to let anyone near until Bill produced something that stopped Janet in her tracks: Max's old collar, still carrying the familiar scent after 6 months. Luna's reaction was immediate and profound. Her rigid posture relaxed slightly, and she allowed Janet to begin cleaning her wounds while maintaining constant eye contact with Bill. It was as if she recognized something in the scent, some genetic memory that whispered of trust earned and loyalty given freely. The youngest male, barely 2 years old but already bearing scars that spoke of a hard life, presented the most heartbreaking case. Bruno, as Bill decided to call him, showed signs of severe malnutrition and what appeared to be broken ribs that had healed improperly. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They held the hollow look of an animal that had never known kindness. "This is going to cost thousands," Janet said bluntly as she worked. "Medications, specialized food, ongoing therapy, and that's assuming they all survive the first week." Bill nodded, the financial reality settling over him like winter fog. "Do what they need. I'll find the money." The first night was the longest of Bill's life since Sarah's final days in the hospital. He'd set up temporary quarters in the barn, unwilling to leave the dogs alone in their fragile state. Rex had claimed the corner nearest to Bill's makeshift bed, while Luna and Bruno huddled together in protective proximity. Around midnight, his phone rang. Jennifer's voice carried the strain of someone who'd been crying. "Grandpa, what have you done? Martha Chen called me. $50,000 for dogs. When you're about to lose the ranch?" The conversation that followed was painful in ways that cut deeper than financial worry. Jennifer accused him of choosing animals over family, of throwing away her education fund on a whim, of losing his grip on reality in his grief over Max. "I know how much you loved him," she said, her voice breaking. "But this won't bring Max back. This will just destroy everything you and Grandma built." Bill tried to explain about the auction, about the look in Rex's eyes, about debts that couldn't be measured in dollars, but how could he make a 24-year-old medical student understand that sometimes doing the right thing required risking everything you had? "I've got to try," he said finally. "At my age, you don't make new friends, you just try to keep the old ones alive. Maybe these 3 need someone who understands that." The community reaction was swift and decisive. By the second day, Bill's mailbox overflowed with letters ranging from supportive to vitriolic. Someone had started a Facebook group called Stop Dangerous Dogs in Our Town, which had gained 300 members overnight. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Rancher Risks Everything for Rescued Dogs, complete with quotes from neighbors expressing concern about public safety and fiscal responsibility. Tom Bradley was quoted as saying, "Bill's a good man, but this decision puts all our families at risk." More troubling were the anonymous phone calls that started on the third day. Voices distorted by cheap voice modulators delivered threats against both Bill and the dogs. Someone spray-painted "dog killer" on his mailbox, and tire tracks in his front yard suggested late-night visits from unwelcome observers. But there were unexpected allies, too. Sarah Martinez brought homemade food and stayed to help with the dog's evening medications. Her teenage son, Miguel, volunteered to help with feeding and cleaning, saying his father would have wanted him to support a fellow veteran. "Dad always said military dogs were heroes," Miguel explained as he carefully approached Bruno with a bowl of specialized food. "Said they saved more soldiers than most people ever knew about." The breakthrough with Bruno came on the fourth day. Bill had been sitting quietly in the corner of the barn, reading aloud from an old Louis L'Amour novel, the same ritual he'd shared with Max during rainy afternoons. Bruno had been watching from across the barn, his young face cycling through expressions that seemed to war between curiosity and caution. Slowly, so slowly that Bill almost didn't notice, Bruno began moving closer. An inch at a time, pausing between movements as if expecting punishment, the young dog made his way across the barn floor until he was close enough to touch. When Bruno finally pressed his nose against Bill's knee, the old rancher felt tears he'd been holding back for months finally break free. Here was trust, rebuilding itself one careful moment at a time, proof that love could survive even systematic cruelty if given the chance to grow. The town hall meeting was called for the following Thursday, ostensibly to discuss public safety concerns, but really serving as a forum for the community to voice their feelings about Bill's decision. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the corridor. Mayor Patricia Williams tried to maintain order as voices rose in heated debate. Sam Fletcher, whose cattle ranch bordered Bill's property, stood up to express the concerns many shared. "Look, we all respect Bill's service and his right to make his own decisions, but bringing 3 attack-trained German Shepherds into our community? My grandkids play in the creek that runs between our properties. What happens when those dogs remember their training?" The crowd murmured agreement, but Sarah Martinez stood up with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through military widowhood. "Has anyone here actually seen these dogs? Because I have. I've watched Bill work with them, watched him help them remember what trust looks like. They're not weapons. They're patience." Dr. Janet Morrison added her professional opinion. "German Shepherds are naturally protective, but they're also incredibly intelligent and capable of rehabilitation. The breed's reputation for aggression comes from poor training and abuse, not genetic predisposition." But it was Father Michael O'Brien who shifted the room's energy. The elderly priest had served the community for 30 years and commanded respect across denominational lines. "I've been thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the packed hall, "about how someone stopped to help when others passed by. Bill Henderson saw suffering and responded with his heart instead of his wallet. Maybe that's not foolish. Maybe that's faithful." The meeting ended without resolution, but lines had been drawn. The community was split between those who saw Bill's actions as dangerous and those who recognized them as heroic. What everyone agreed on was that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. That night, Bill sat in his barn surrounded by 3 dogs who were learning to trust again. Rex had begun responding to basic commands, his military breeding reasserting itself now that kindness had replaced cruelty in his training. Luna had started eating regularly and was showing signs of the maternal protectiveness that suggested she might be pregnant. Bruno was still the most fragile, but his willingness to seek comfort spoke of a resilience that gave Bill hope. "What do you think, friends?" he asked the dogs, who watched him with the patient attention that German shepherds gave to pack leaders they respected. "Are we doing the right thing here?" Rex's answer came in the form of a low whine and a tentative tail wag, the first sign of happiness Bill had seen from any of them. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince him that some battles were worth fighting, even when you couldn't afford to win. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Montana mountains, promising weather that would test everyone's resolve. But inside the barn, 3 broken souls were learning to trust again, and a man who'd carried the weight of isolation was discovering that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The financial countdown continued, 26 days until foreclosure, but Bill had stopped looking at calendars. He'd learned long ago that some things were more valuable than property, more lasting than money, and more necessary than security. Love was one of those things, and love didn't calculate costs before it acted. As he settled in for another night of watching over his charges, Bill reflected on something Sarah used to say. "The heart has its own mathematics, honey. It doesn't add and subtract like a bank statement. It multiplies and divides in ways that would confuse any accountant." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new decisions. But tonight, 3 dogs slept peacefully for the first time in months, and that was enough mathematics for any man's heart. The confrontation began at dawn on a Tuesday that would later be marked as the day everything changed. Bill woke to the sound of vehicles approaching his ranch, not the familiar rumble of neighbor pickup trucks, but the expensive purr of luxury sedans and the aggressive growl of modified engines that spoke of trouble looking for a place to happen. Through the barn window, he counted 6 vehicles forming a semicircle around his property. Marcus Steele stepped out of a black Mercedes, flanked by men whose posture and bearing screamed professional enforcement. These weren't ranch hands or local tough guys. These were the kind of people who made problems disappear for clients who could afford discretion. "Mr. Henderson," Steele called across the yard, his voice carrying the false courtesy that preceded ultimatums. "We need to discuss the return of my property." Bill emerged from the barn, Rex at his side with Luna and Bruno flanking them in a formation that would have made any canine trainer proud. The dogs had sensed the threat before the vehicles appeared, their months of recovery not erasing instincts honed by survival and, in Rex's case, military breeding that ran generations deep. "Your property?" Bill kept his voice level, though his hand rested on the rifle he'd retrieved from the barn. "I seem to recall paying for these dogs fair and square." Steele's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. "There are irregularities in the sale, documentation issues that call the legitimacy of the transaction into question. My legal team has prepared papers transferring ownership back to Apex Security Solutions." The documents one of Steele's men produced looked official enough to fool most people, complete with courthouse stamps and legal language that made Bill's head spin. But 40 years of dealing with livestock sales and property disputes had taught him to recognize real legal documents from convincing forgeries. "These papers aren't worth the ink they're printed on," Bill said, crumpling the documents and tossing them back. "You want my dogs, you'll have to go through proper channels." That's when Luna stepped forward, positioning herself between Bill and the approaching men. Her lip curled back in a silent snarl that revealed canine teeth capable of crushing bone. The maternal protectiveness that had sustained her through captivity now focused on defending the man who'd given her freedom. "Careful," Steele warned his men as they hesitated. "That female's killed before, they all have." It's what they were trained for. But Bill was watching Rex, seeing something in the big male's posture that reminded him of canine partners he'd worked with in Vietnam. There was intelligence there, assessment happening behind amber eyes that were calculating threats and measuring distances with military precision. "Stand down," Bill said quietly, and Rex immediately relaxed his stance, though his attention never left Steele's men. The command response was immediate and perfect, not the mechanical obedience of a broken animal, but the willing cooperation of a partner who trusted his handler's judgment. Steele's eyes narrowed as he processed what he'd just witnessed. Interesting. They respond to you like they've known you for years, almost like they remember you from somewhere. The observation sent a chill down Bill's spine. There was something in Steele's tone that suggested knowledge he shouldn't have, familiarity with these specific dogs that went beyond their recent auction encounter. "I don't know what game you're playing," Bill said, his military training reasserting itself as he assessed angles and cover options, "but you're not taking these dogs. Not today, not ever." That's when the situation exploded into chaos. It started with Bruno, the youngest and most traumatized of the three, suddenly bolting toward the tree line. His panic response triggered every protective instinct in Luna, who bounded after him with a maternal desperation that overrode everything else. Rex held his position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to ensure Bill was moving toward cover, before following his packmates into the forest. Steele's men moved with practiced efficiency, producing tranquilizer guns and radio equipment with the smooth coordination of a military unit. But they were dealing with animals who'd survived months of captivity through intelligence and cunning, dogs whose German Shepherd breeding gave them advantages in rough terrain that no human could match. "Track them!" Steele barked into his radio. "I want those animals back in cages within the hour." But Bill was already moving, grabbing his hunting rifle and heading for the forest path he'd walked countless times with Max. He knew this land better than anyone, knew every deer trail and water source, every hiding spot that could shelter 3 frightened animals. The chase that followed tested everyone involved. Steele's men were professionals, but they were operating in unfamiliar territory against animals whose survival instincts had been honed by months of abuse. The dogs moved like ghosts through the Montana timber, appearing and vanishing with a coordination that spoke of pack intelligence evolved over thousands of years. Bill found them first, huddled in a cave system he'd discovered during his first year on the ranch. Bruno was pressed against the back wall, his young face cycling through terror and confusion. Luna positioned herself at the cave entrance, ready to fight anything that threatened her adopted family. Rex stood beside her, his military bearing evident even in their desperate circumstances. "Easy, friends," Bill whispered, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm not going to let them take you." The reunion was brief but profound. Rex pressed his nose against Bill's palm in the gesture of trust that had become their greeting. Luna allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, leaning against Bill's leg while keeping her eyes on the cave entrance. Bruno crept forward just far enough to touch his nose to Bill's knee, the first time he'd initiated contact since the auction. "We can't stay here," Bill murmured, listening to the sounds of pursuit growing closer. "They'll find us eventually." That's when Rex did something that stopped Bill's breath. The big male moved to the cave entrance and released a howl that echoed across the mountainside. Not the sound of a domestic dog, but something wilder, older, carrying messages that touched genetic memories buried deep in canine DNA. The response came from unexpected directions. Other dogs began answering from across the valley. Farm dogs, hunting companions, strays that had learned to survive in the margins between civilization and wilderness. The sound built into a chorus that spoke of solidarity, of a community under threat, of pack loyalty extending beyond blood to encompass all who shared the bond between human and canine. Down in the valley, Steele's men paused in their pursuit as the howling surrounded them. These were professionals used to intimidating humans, But facing the unified voice of every dog within miles created a psychological pressure that urban-bred enforcers weren't equipped to handle. "Sir," one of them reported over radio, his voice tight with uncharacteristic uncertainty, "we've got a situation. Local dogs are responding to the targets. Whole valleys lit up." But the real game changer was already in motion. Sarah Martinez had heard the howling and recognized it for what it was, a call for help that transcended species boundaries. She'd spent enough time around military dogs to understand pack dynamics, and she knew that Rex's howl was rallying every dog in the area to form a defensive perimeter around the cave. Her phone call to Sheriff David Kowalski brought law enforcement racing toward Bill's ranch just as the situation reached its breaking point. The sheriff arrived to find armed men with tranquilizer guns pursuing a 72-year-old veteran and 3 dogs through federally protected forest land. "Stand down!" Kowalski shouted, his patrol car sliding to a stop between Steele's men and the forest. "Weapons on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" The standoff that followed played out like something from a Western movie, with modern tensions layered over ancient themes of justice and protection. Steele's legal papers proved to be sophisticated forgeries. His men were carrying unlicensed firearms, and his presence on Bill's property constituted criminal trespass. But the real revelation came when one of Steele's men, faced with potential federal charges for operating on protected land, decided cooperation was preferable to loyalty. "Boss isn't just after the dogs," he told Sheriff Kowalski while Steele glared daggers from the back of a patrol car. "This whole thing's personal. He's been tracking those animals for months, waiting for the right moment to make his move." The confession opened floodgates that revealed the true scope of Steele's operation. Apex Security Solutions was a front for a network that bred, trained, and distributed animals for illegal purposes ranging from underground fighting to intimidation and worse. The 3 German Shepherds weren't just inventory, they were evidence of systematic abuse that reached into multiple states and involved clients whose names would shock the public. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, Bill sat in the cave with 3 dogs who'd taught him that family came in many forms. Rex had resumed his position as guardian, while Luna and Bruno flanked Bill like bookends. The crisis had passed, but the bond forged in those desperate hours would last forever. Sheriff Kowalski appeared at the cave entrance, his expression mixing relief with professional concern. "Bill, we need to talk about what happens next." "And those dogs are evidence in a federal case now? There are going to be complications." But Bill was looking at Rex, seeing something in those amber eyes that reminded him of promises made and kept, of loyalty that flowed both ways, of connections that couldn't be broken by legal documents or federal investigations. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, his hand resting on Rex's head, "we face it together." The howling had stopped, but its echo seemed to linger in the mountain air, a reminder that some bonds transcended species, some loyalties couldn't be purchased, and some families chose each other across barriers that civilization tried to maintain. In saving 3 dogs, Bill Henderson had discovered that sometimes being saved required the courage to risk everything for love that couldn't be quantified or controlled. As they made their way back down the mountain, Bill reflected on something Sarah used to say about families being made of choice as much as blood. Looking at his 3 companions, he understood that truth in ways he'd never imagined possible. The heart attack came without warning on a Thursday morning that had started like any other. Bill was in the barn preparing breakfast for Rex, Luna, and Bruno when the crushing pain hit his chest like a sledgehammer blow. The feed bucket clattered to the floor as he stumbled against the wall, his left arm going numb while fire spread across his rib cage. Rex was at his side before Bill hit the ground, the big German Shepherd's military training asserting itself in ways that transcended the abuse he'd endured. The dog positioned himself to break Bill's fall, then immediately began the alert sequence he'd been taught years ago. Sharp, rhythmic barking that carried across the valley like an emergency beacon. Luna joined the alert, her maternal instincts recognizing a pack member in crisis. Bruno, still the most fragile of the three, pressed close to Bill's side, offering whatever comfort his young presence could provide. Together, their voices created a symphony of distress that reached every farm within 3 miles. Sarah Martinez was hanging laundry when she heard the desperate barking. 20 years as a military wife had taught her to recognize emergency signals in any form, and the coordinated alarm from Bill's property sent her racing for her phone even before her conscious mind processed what she was hearing. 911, this is Sarah Martinez on County Road 47. We have a medical emergency at the Henderson Ranch. The dogs are in full alert. Send paramedics immediately. The dispatcher's training kicked in as she processed the unusual call. Ma'am, did you witness the emergency directly? Those dogs were trained for military service, Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency as she grabbed her keys. When they bark like that, someone's dying. Send everything you have. Tom Bradley heard the commotion from his adjacent property and arrived at Bill's barn just as the ambulance sirens became audible in the distance. What he found challenged every assumption he'd held about the 3 German shepherds his neighbor had sacrificed everything to save. Rex had positioned himself to keep Bill's airway clear, his large body serving as a windbreak against the autumn chill. Luna had somehow managed to drag a horse blanket over to cover the unconscious man, while Bruno stood guard at the barn entrance, his young body trembling with the effort to overcome his traumatic conditioning and protect the human who'd shown him kindness. Jesus Christ, Tom whispered, pulling out his phone to call Jennifer. These aren't dangerous animals. They're guardian angels. The paramedics worked with professional efficiency, but they couldn't help noticing how the 3 dogs facilitated their efforts. Rex moved aside when directed but remained close enough to monitor Bill's condition. Luna positioned herself where she could watch both the medical team and the barn entrance. Bruno, despite his obvious anxiety around strangers, allowed the paramedics to work without interference. I've never seen anything like it, EMT Patricia Wong told her partner as they loaded Bill into the ambulance. Those dogs are acting like trained medical assistants. The drive to Billings General Hospital became a race against time, complicated by the dog's refusal to be separated from Bill. Rex managed to leap into the ambulance before the doors closed, and no amount of coaxing could convince him to leave his unconscious handler's side. Let him stay, Patricia decided, watching Rex position himself where he could monitor Bill's breathing without interfering with medical equipment. I think that dog knows more about patient care than some orderlies I've worked with. Jennifer arrived at the hospital just as Bill was being wheeled into the cardiac unit, her medical school training warring with granddaughter panic as she processed the gravity of his condition. The massive heart attack had damaged significant portions of his heart muscle, and his age made recovery uncertain at best. Is he going to make it? She asked Dr. Richard Steinberg, trying to maintain professional composure while her world collapsed around the possibility of losing the only family she had left. The next 48 hours are critical, Dr. Steinberg replied with the careful honesty that marked experienced cardiologists. His age works against us, but he's in remarkable physical condition for 72. That military discipline apparently extended to taking care of himself. What the medical team couldn't explain was Rex's behavior in the cardiac ICU. Despite hospital policies prohibiting animals in sterile environments, the German Shepherd had somehow established himself as Bill's unofficial guardian. Nurses found him impossible to remove, and his presence seemed to have a calming effect on both Bill and other patients in the unit. That dog's heart rate syncs with your grandfather's, Dr. Steinberg told Jennifer during one of their bedside vigils. I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of practice. It's almost like they're sharing vital signs. Luna and Bruno had taken up residence in the hospital parking lot, accepting food and water from visiting well-wishers, but refusing to leave the vicinity of the building where their pack leader lay fighting for his life. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly the entire valley was following the vigil of 3 dogs whose loyalty transcended the abuse they'd suffered. The community response surprised everyone, including those who'd opposed Bill's decision to rescue the dogs. Tom Bradley organized a fundraising drive that raised $12,000 in 3 days. Sarah Martinez coordinated a meal train for Jennifer and the hospital staff. Even some who'd called Bill foolish found themselves moved by the dog's dedication. Father Michael O'Brien held a special prayer service at St. Michael's Catholic Church, but what made it remarkable was the number of people who attended with their own dogs. The sanctuary filled with an unprecedented gathering of species united in concern for one man and the animals he'd risked everything to save. "Lord," the elderly priest prayed, his voice carrying across the packed church, "we ask for healing not just of body but of understanding. Help us see that love comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest courage is shown by those who cannot speak for themselves." On the second night, Bill's condition deteriorated rapidly. Alarms sounded throughout the cardiac unit as his heart rhythm became increasingly erratic. Jennifer stood helplessly beside his bed, watching numbers on monitors that painted an increasingly grim picture of his chances. That's when Rex did something that stopped every medical professional in the ICU. The big German Shepherd placed his paws carefully on Bill's chest and began a rhythmic pressure sequence that perfectly mimicked CPR chest compressions. The action was so precise, so clearly intentional, that Dr. Steinberg actually stepped back to watch. "He's trying to restart his heart," the cardiologist whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "That dog is performing cardiac massage." Bill's eyes fluttered open just as Rex completed his improvised medical intervention. The first thing he saw was amber eyes filled with intelligence and concern, the face of an animal who'd repaid kindness with the kind of loyalty that transcended species boundaries. "Hey, friend," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying profound gratitude. "You saved me again, didn't you?" Jennifer collapsed into the bedside chair, tears streaming down her face as she realized how close she'd come to losing the most important person in her world. But her relief was tempered by the knowledge that Bill's recovery would be long and uncertain, complicated by financial pressures that the heart attack had only made worse. The medical bills were already astronomical, and Bill's insurance covered only a fraction of the specialized cardiac care he needed. The ranch was still facing foreclosure, now with the added burden of medical debt that could destroy any hope of recovery. "Grandpa," Jennifer said softly, taking his weathered hand in hers, "we need to talk about practical things. The ranch, the money, what happens next?" But Bill was looking at Rex, seeing something in those intelligent eyes that reminded him of promises made and debts that transcended financial obligations. The dog had risked his own safety to save a human who'd shown him kindness, proving that love was indeed a currency that operated by different mathematics than bank accounts. "Some things can't be measured in dollars," he told his granddaughter, his voice gaining strength with each word. "These 3 taught me that, whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside in the parking lot, Luna and Bruno waited with the patient devotion that defined their species at its finest. They'd maintained their vigil through rain and cold, accepting comfort from strangers, but never abandoning their post. The local newspaper had begun calling them the guardian angels of Billings General, and their story was spreading far beyond Montana's borders. As Bill drifted back into healing sleep, Rex curled up beside the hospital bed in violation of every policy in the facility's handbook. but no one had the heart to remove him, not after witnessing the medical miracle of interspecies loyalty that had quite literally brought a man back from the edge of death. The crisis had passed, but its aftermath would test everything Bill Henderson believed about the relationship between sacrifice and love, between financial security and spiritual wealth, between the family you're born into and the family you choose. The revelation came 3 days after Bill's heart attack, delivered by a man whose face had haunted his nightmares for 30 years. Marcus Steele walked into Bill's hospital room without invitation, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the sterile medical environment, but his eyes carried a vulnerability that transformed his entire presence. "Hello, Dad." The words hit Bill like a second cardiac event. Jennifer, who'd been dozing in the bedside chair, jerked awake to see a stranger whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to her grandfather's strong jawline and penetrating gaze. Rex, who'd been lying peacefully beside the bed, immediately went on alert, positioning himself between the newcomer and his recovering handler. "Michael?" Bill's voice was barely a whisper, his mind struggling to reconcile the son who'd disappeared 30 years ago with the predator who'd tried to reclaim 3 abused dogs. "My God, what have you become?" The man who now called himself Marcus Steele pulled a chair close to the bed, his movements careful and deliberate. The expensive clothes couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. "I became what you made me," Michael said, but the venom that should have accompanied such words was absent, replaced by something that sounded almost like exhaustion. "A man who understands that loyalty is a luxury most people can't afford." Jennifer found her voice, medical training helping her process shock into questions. "You're my uncle. The one who left when Dad was little? Grandpa said you joined the army and lost touch." Michael's laugh held no humor. "Is that the story he told? That I joined the army?" He turned to Bill, whose face had gone pale despite his improving cardiac numbers. "Tell her the truth, Dad." "Tell her why I really left home at 17. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady beep of Bill's heart monitor and Rex's low, warning growl. The dog's intelligence was evident in how he assessed the emotional tension without understanding the words, responding to pack dynamics that transcended human language. Bill closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of regret. "Your father, my son, was attacked by one of my military dogs when he was 12 years old. King, a German shepherd, I was training for deployment. The dog had been abused before I got him, wasn't properly socialized. Michael tried to pet him while I was on the phone, and King nearly killed him." Jennifer's medical knowledge filled in the horrific details her grandfather couldn't voice. Dog attacks on children could cause psychological trauma that lasted lifetimes, especially when the incident involved a trusted family environment and a parent's working animal. 37 stitches, Michael said quietly, his hand unconsciously moving to touch scars hidden beneath his shirt collar. 3 days in the hospital. And when I woke up, you know what my father said? The dog was just doing what he was trained to do. You shouldn't have approached him without permission. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere with the toxic residue of old wounds. Bill's heart monitor showed increased stress, but his eyes remained fixed on his son's face, seeing for the first time how that traumatic day had shaped everything that followed. "You chose the dog over me," Michael continued, his voice steady but carrying undertones of pain that no amount of wealth or power could heal. "Even after what happened, King stayed. I was the one who had to go." "That's not how it was," Bill protested, but his words lacked conviction. Memory was reshaping itself as he spoke, 30 years of justified narrative crumbling under the weight of his son's perspective. Jennifer was processing family history through the lens of psychological trauma, understanding dawning in her expression. Is that why you went after the dogs? Because they reminded you of King? Michael's attention shifted to Rex, who'd been following the conversation with the intelligent alertness that marked his breed's finest examples. Not at first. Apex Security Solutions started as legitimate business, high-end protection services for corporate clients. But when I learned that my father had spent his life's savings on 3 German shepherds, when I saw him risk everything for animals that could have been King's descendants. He paused, watching Rex's amber eyes with something that might have been recognition or fear. I had to know if he'd finally learned the lesson, if people mattered more than dogs. The twisted logic of the test revealed itself in Michael's confession. The auction hadn't been about profit or even revenge in any simple sense. It had been an elaborate psychological experiment designed to answer the question that had tormented him since childhood. Would his father choose human family over canine loyalty if forced to make the choice again? "But you didn't choose," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through revelations that were clearly occurring to him in real time. "You chose both. You risked your ranch, your granddaughter's future, your own health, everything, to save 3 animals that reminded you of the choice you made 30 years ago." Bill felt tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed since Sarah's funeral finally break free. "I was wrong, son. I was so focused on duty, on training, on doing my job right, that I forgot the most important job I had. Being your father." The DNA revelation came next, delivered by Dr. Janet Morrison, who'd arrived to check on her most famous patients. The veterinary genetic testing she'd ordered during the dog's initial treatment had revealed bloodlines that connected directly to Bill's military service. "Rex is descended from the breeding program you worked with in the 1990s, she announced, oblivious to the emotional minefield she was entering. "The genetic markers are clear. His great-grandfather was probably one of the dogs you helped train for overseas deployment." The coincidence was too profound to be accidental, and Michael's expression confirmed what everyone in the room was beginning to understand. This entire situation, the auction, the specific dogs, the timing, had been orchestrated with a precision that spoke of extensive planning and deeper knowledge than anyone had suspected. "You knew," Jennifer said, staring at her uncle with a mixture of horror and fascination. "You knew exactly which dogs would affect him the most." Michael nodded slowly. "I've been tracking military breeding lines for years. When these 3 came into my custody through a legitimate bust of a puppy mill operation, I recognized the genetic signatures immediately. Rex carries King's bloodline. Luna and Bruno are from the same program Dad worked with after King was retired." The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened, transforming a story of simple rescue into something far more complex. Michael hadn't been trying to profit from animal abuse. He'd been conducting an elaborate test of his father's priorities, using dogs whose genetics guaranteed maximum emotional impact. "I wanted to see if you'd learned," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "If you'd finally put family first when the choice was literally life or death." But Bill was looking at Rex, seeing in those intelligent eyes the legacy of choices made and unmade, of loyalties tested and proven. And the dog had positioned himself so he could monitor both humans while remaining ready to protect the one who'd earned his trust through kindness rather than fear. "I learned something I didn't expect," Bill said finally, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Family isn't about choosing between love and loyalty. It's about understanding that love multiplies when you give it away, and loyalty shared makes everyone stronger." Michael's carefully constructed emotional barriers began to crack as he watched Rex respond to Bill's voice with the kind of devoted attention he remembered from his own childhood, before trauma had poisoned his relationship with dogs, and, by extension, with his father. "I've spent 30 years hating German shepherds," he admitted, his hand slowly extending toward Rex. building a business that treated them like commodities instead of companions. All because I couldn't separate the species from the individual animal that hurt me. Rex's response was immediate and profound. Despite having every reason to fear this man who'd orchestrated his abuse, the dog moved forward to sniff Michael's outstretched hand. The gesture was tentative, cautious, but unmistakably an offering of the same trust that had saved Bill's life just days before. "He doesn't hate you," Bill observed, watching the careful interaction between his son and the dog who carried his past's genetic legacy. "Animals don't hold grudges the way humans do. They judge each moment on its own merit." The healing that began in that hospital room would take years to complete, if it ever could be. But as Jennifer watched her grandfather and uncle tentatively rebuild a relationship destroyed by trauma and misunderstanding, she began to see how 3 rescued German shepherds had become catalysts for a kind of redemption that couldn't be purchased or planned. Outside in the parking lot, Luna and Bruno waited with the patient devotion that had sustained them through abuse and recovery alike. They'd maintained their vigil through rain and cold, proof that some bonds transcended individual suffering to embrace the kind of collective healing that made broken families whole again. The financial crisis remained unsolved, the ranch still faced foreclosure, and the medical bills continued to mount. But in that sterile hospital room, 3 generations of a fractured family began to understand that some debts could only be paid with forgiveness, and some wealth could only be measured in the courage required to love without conditions. As Michael finally allowed Rex to touch his scarred hand with a gentle nose, the circle that had been broken 30 years earlier began to close in ways none of them had expected or planned. 3 months later, the Second Chance Sanctuary occupied the land where Bill Henderson's cattle ranch had once struggled to survive. The transformation was remarkable not just in scope but in the way it had united a community that had been divided by fear and misunderstanding just months before. The foreclosure had proceeded as scheduled, but instead of losing everything, Bill had discovered that his son Michael possessed the kind of wealth that could reshape landscapes both literal and metaphorical. Apex Security Solutions had been dismantled overnight, its assets liquidated to fund something Michael called a debt 30 years overdue. "I spent 3 decades building a business that profited from animal suffering," Michael told the gathered crowd at the sanctuary's dedication ceremony. "It seems only fitting that those profits should go toward healing the damage I helped create." The facility sprawled across 200 acres of prime Montana grassland, featuring state-of-the-art veterinary clinics, rehabilitation centers, and living spaces designed specifically for animals recovering from abuse and neglect. But what made it special wasn't the impressive infrastructure. It was the philosophy that guided every decision. Dr. Janet Morrison had signed on as head veterinarian, bringing with her a team of specialists who understood that healing trauma required more than medical intervention. The sanctuary operated on principles that recognized the emotional intelligence of animals and the therapeutic value of interspecies relationships. "We don't just treat symptoms here," she explained to a visiting reporter from the Billings Gazette. "We rebuild trust. We help animals remember what it feels like to be safe, to be loved, to have choices about their own lives." Rex had become the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador, his transformation from broken abuse victim to confident therapy dog, inspiring everyone who witnessed his journey. His military breeding reasserted itself not in aggression or fear, but in the kind of protective leadership that made other animals feel secure enough to begin their own healing processes. Luna had given birth to 7 healthy puppies in the sanctuary's specially designed maternity ward, each one representing hope for a future where breeding was about love rather than profit. The puppies had been placed with carefully screened families, primarily military veterans who understood the unique bond between humans and working dogs. Bruno, once the most traumatized of the three, had surprised everyone by developing into a therapy dog with an intuitive understanding of human emotional needs. His work with children who'd suffered abuse created connections that transcended species boundaries, proving that healing often came through helping others heal. Jennifer had made the decision to specialize in veterinary medicine rather than human medicine, her grandfather's example teaching her that healing came in many forms. Her medical school debt had been quietly absorbed by the Michael Henderson Foundation, established with funds from the liquidation of Apex Security Solutions. "At first I thought Grandpa was crazy," she told the dedication crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled supporters. $50,000 for 3 dying dogs when we were facing foreclosure seemed like the decision of a man who'd lost touch with reality. Now I understand that he was the only one of us who was seeing clearly. The community response had been transformative. Tom Bradley, once Bill's harshest critic, now served on the sanctuary's board of directors. Sarah Martinez had become the facility's volunteer coordinator, organizing a network of supporters that extended across 3 counties. Father Michael O'Brien delivered the dedication blessing with words that captured the spiritual dimension of what they'd created together. "This place stands as proof that redemption is possible, that broken things can be made whole, and that love truly does multiply when we choose to share it rather than hoard it." The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Bill, still recovering from his heart attack but determined to speak, approached the podium with Rex at his side. The dog's presence had become as natural as breathing, a partnership that demonstrated the kind of trust that could develop between species when both chose vulnerability over self-protection. "6 months ago, I thought I was saving 3 dogs," Bill said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned profound truths through nearly losing everything. "What I discovered is that they were saving me. Rex taught me that loyalty isn't about blind obedience. It's about choosing to trust despite every reason not to. Luna showed me that protecting others is how we protect ourselves. And Bruno proved that even the most broken spirits can learn to love again if someone's willing to be patient." He paused, looking out over a crowd that included people who'd opposed him months earlier and now stood as the sanctuary's strongest supporters. But the real lesson came from watching this community transform fear into understanding, judgment into compassion. We learned that family isn't limited by species, that healing happens in community, and that sometimes the most foolish-looking decision is actually the wisest choice you can make. Michael stood in the back of the crowd, still uncomfortable with public attention, but visibly moved by his father's words. The reconciliation between them remained a work in progress, complicated by decades of hurt and misunderstanding, but the foundation had been laid for something stronger than the relationship they'd lost. The sanctuary's first year had already seen remarkable success. 47 animals had been rehabilitated and placed in loving homes, with success rates that exceeded national averages. The key was the holistic approach that addressed psychological trauma alongside physical injuries, recognizing that healing required more than medical intervention. But the most significant achievement couldn't be measured in statistics. The sanctuary had become a symbol of what was possible when communities chose collaboration over conflict, when individuals prioritized love over fear, when broken relationships found the courage to rebuild on foundations of forgiveness and understanding. As the dedication ceremony concluded, Bill found himself surrounded by 3 generations of his family: Jennifer, Michael, and the 7 German Shepherd puppies who carried forward the genetic legacy of dogs who'd served their country and the bloodline of animals who'd learned to trust again after systematic abuse. Rex, Luna, and Bruno moved among the crowd with the confident ease of animals who'd found their place in the world. Their transformation from broken victims to healing ambassadors embodied everything the sanctuary represented, proof that trauma didn't have to define identity, that love could overcome even the most systematic cruelty, and that the bonds between species could create healing that transcended individual suffering. The sun was setting over the Montana mountains as the last visitors departed, painting the sky in shades of amber that matched Rex's eyes. Bill sat on the porch of his new home, a modest cabin on the sanctuary grounds, surrounded by the family he'd chosen and the family that had chosen him. "You know what I figured out?" he said to Rex, who was lying contentedly at his feet. "Sarah was right about love having its own mathematics. It doesn't subtract when you give it away. It multiplies, compounds, creates interest that pays dividends you never expected." Michael approached from the main building, his expensive suit replaced by jeans and a work shirt that made him look more like the son Bill remembered from before trauma had driven them apart. "The first group of veterans arrives next week," he reported, settling into the chair beside his father. 12 men and women dealing with PTSD, each paired with a rescue dog that's been through our rehabilitation program. Bill nodded, watching Luna supervise her puppy's evening play session with the patient attention that marked excellent mothers in any species. "Seems fitting. Broken soldiers, helping broken animals, both of them healing together." As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Bill reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely old rancher facing financial ruin and the loss of everything he'd worked for. Tonight, he was surrounded by family, both human and canine, part of something larger than individual survival, connected to a community that had learned to see past differences to shared values of compassion and mutual support. Rex stirred at his feet, amber eyes reflecting starlight as he maintained the vigilant watch that had become second nature. The debt that had begun with 3 dying dogs in auction cages had been paid forward into something that would outlast all of them, a legacy of love that multiplied with every animal saved, every family reunited, every heart that learned to trust again. At 72, Bill Henderson thought his story was ending, a widower facing foreclosure, watching his life's work crumble while his granddaughter struggled with medical school debt. But sometimes our greatest chapters begin when we think the book is closing. When Bill saw 3 broken German shepherds at that auction, something stirred in his heart that numbers on a bank statement couldn't calculate. He risked his ranch, his reputation, and his future for creatures that couldn't even thank him. Yet in saving them, he discovered what we often forget in our golden years, that love doesn't diminish when we share it. It multiplies. The dogs didn't just heal, they became healers. His fractured family found reconciliation. His skeptical community learned compassion. Most importantly, Bill learned that at any age we can still write new chapters, still choose love over fear, still build legacies that outlast property deeds and bank accounts. The Second Chance Sanctuary stands today because one man decided that some things matter more than money, that loyalty flows both ways across species, and that the courage to love without conditions can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Sometimes the most foolish decisions are the wisest investments we ever make. Discussion questions. Have you ever made a decision that others called foolish but your heart knew was right? What happened? What unexpected friendship or bond has brought the most meaning to your later years? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.